Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. You know, I like a lot of books. I'm a reader, I'll admit that. But there's some that really stand out because they're so different. Ones that deal with topics that I have no background in, but I'm interested in. And this is one of those. I think I've done two previous podcasts. And this is called The Search for Messiah. The Search for Messiah. And what's fascinating about it is this is two authors, Mark Eastman and Chuck Smith. They look back at ancient rabbis, and they look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they look back at old commentaries and give us an idea of what they expected, the ancients, what they expected to be their Messiah, and to see if Jesus fulfills the messianic requirements. Now, today, of course, modern rabbis will reject the messianic claim of Jesus, and they'll say, well, he didn't fulfill these requirements. They teach a very different view of Jesus. So the question is, what did the ancients believe? Because they're the ones that were closest to their documents, and they did not have any prejudice. They're dealing with just looking at their manuscripts. So I did a previous podcast on the time of the Messiah coming. That's one of the chapters in this book. And then I did something on the suffering servant that Isaiah talks about. So I wanted to look this time, we'll see how much time we have, but I want to do at least one chapter, maybe two. Here's one chapter called Messiah, the Son of God, ? And the authors point out that that's a real contentious issue between modern-day Jewish and Christian scholars, and that is the Messiah being the, quote, Son of God, end quote. Of course, the Christian New Testament is pretty clear. Jesus believed he was the Son of God, and the disciples believed that, but that's rejected by many 20th century rabbis. They claim Messiah was just a man. So one of the authors said that they had a discussion about the Messiah with a Jewish physician who is a Torah scholar. He told me virtually all modern rabbis believe the Messiah was going to be just a man. He'd be great in wisdom and in stature, but just a man. He wouldn't be God in the flesh. He wouldn't be the Son of God. And he went on to tell this author, and I'm not sure whether it was Eastman or Chuck Smith. Now, Eastman is a medical doctor, so that's what I'm guessing, that this is Eastman talking. So he says, when he's talking to this Jewish physician, he said, this idea that the Messiah is the Son of God, that's a Christian fabrication. There was no evidence from the Old Testament or the ancient rabbis in their writings that the Messiah would be the Son of God. Even today, when one asks a modern rabbi, why do you reject the messiahship of Jesus? He'll say, because Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. So he says it's widely held, but this was not always so. And this is their point of this chapter. There's abundant evidence in the writings of the ancient rabbis, as well as in apocryphal books, that the Messiah would be the Son of God. And then they said they found, as the people dug up the Dead Sea Scrolls, took a look at them, when they got published, they revealed the belief among first century mainstream Judaism that the Messiah would be the Son of God. So they said, let's start off in the chapter here at the claims of Jesus, his disciples, and the leaders of the Jewish nation who rejected him as their Messiah. So I don't think I'll spend as much time on that. Of course, the question is, what did Jesus think of himself? What did others think about him in the New Testament? And, for example, Jesus asked Peter, who do you say that I am? And in Matthew 16, he says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. In John 1, John says, I have seen and testified that this is the Son of God. And when Jesus was under arrest, what did he say in the Sanhedrin? That he was the Son of God. And so they took him to Pilate. He said, hey, Pilate, Jesus claimed to be the Christ, the Messiah. They said, are you then the Son of God? And he said, you rightly say that I am. And they said, what further testimony do we need? We've heard it from our own mouth. And they led him to Pilate. That's Luke 22. And it says he's calling himself a king. So what's fascinating, these two authors say about this, is that the members of the Sanhedrin figured it out. They said that, you're claiming to be the Son of God with claiming to be Christ the Messiah. So that's an interesting comparison. If you look in John 19, the Pharisees told Pilate that the reason that they wanted him tried was because he claimed to be the Son of God. So what's the point? Jesus said he was the Son of God. The disciples claimed he was the Son of God, and the Pharisees took him to Pilate to be tried. Why? Claiming to be the Son of God. Now, of course, a skeptic would say, well, yeah, but that doesn't prove that the ancient rabbis believed this, that the Messiah would be the Son of God. It's just the Christian literature. So at this point, the two authors, now that's Eastman and Smith, start looking at early rabbinic literature. So they take a look at, first place they go to is Psalm 2. And God speaks of his anointed servant and someone who he calls my son. And that's Psalm 2. In this prophecy, there's a reference to the Lord, that's Yahweh, and his anointed, the Hebrew word for Messiah. And the Lord says to the anointed one, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Now, who's this anointed one? Well, it's the word Mashiach, or Messiah, and it's translated as anointed. But modern rabbis say, no, this is not the Messiah. This is an anointed one, one of many, but not the Messiah of Israel. But they said, let's look and see what the rabbis had to say about this psalm. And over, they found that the rabbis believed it applied to the single Messiah. And they have a lot of quotes and places on that in the Midrash and other places. The Messiah would suffer for transgressions. He would be created as a new creature. They recognized that the suffering of the servant in Isaiah 53 and the anointed one in Psalm 2 were the same individual. And so it said, rabbis in the Middle Ages also believed this, that the Messiah and this person that God is talking to in Psalm 2 was the same. Now, they turn next to the book of Enoch. That's one of the apocryphal books dated before the time of Jesus. So that's going to be important. It's before Jesus, at least 100, maybe 150 years before Jesus. And it had a lot of discussions in the book of Enoch about the Messiah in several terms. Sometimes it's, the Messiah is called the woman's son. He's referred to as the Son of Man. And in the oldest portion of the book, he's called the Son of God. So the reference to the Messiah being the Son of God was not an unknown concept when Jesus came in this world. What about the Dead Sea Scrolls? So in the fall of 1991, they finally published some parts of it that hadn't been seen before, released to libraries around the world, and there's some new fragments that came forth. And remember, the people, this is the Qumran community, they were described as zealots. They were mainstream Jews by others, but they wrote extensively about the Messiah. So here's one portion of the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Son of God fragment. If you want the exact number, is 4Q246. Okay, so there's a reference to a supernatural Messiah there who is called the Son of God. And here it is. Here's the quote from the Dead Sea Scroll. He shall be called the Son of the God. They will call him the Son of the Most High. He will judge the earth in righteousness, and every nation will bow down to him. With God's help, he will make war, and God will give all the peoples into his power. That's interesting. It speaks not of a bunch of different anointed figures like some of the modern rabbis say. It's talking about a single individual. He is triumphant. He's exalted. He's called the Son of God, Son of the Most High. He's not an ordinary man. He is believed to be supernatural. Then there's another Dead Sea Scroll section, fragment 4Q521, another reference to a single Messiah figure. He's possessing supernatural godlike traits. So I don't think I'll take the time to read that one, but there's a remarkable similarity there to the belief of Orthodox Christians regarding the Messiah. So the Jews at Qumran believed the Messiah would be the Son of God. He'd be a supernatural being. He'd raise the dead. He'd heal the sick and announce glad tidings to the poor. No ordinary man could do this. And people think that these scroll fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls are somewhere around 100 years before Jesus. Now, again, as they wrap up this chapter, they say most modern rabbis and Jewish Bible scholars claim the belief that the Messiah would be a supernatural son of God. It's just a Christian doctrine. It's not a rabbinical one. But as they have just pointed out, the evidence from the Talmud and the Dead Sea Scrolls gets rid of that idea. So doctrines about the Messiah being the Son of God and being supernatural were espoused by the Jews at Qumran and way back among Hebrew sages. According to the views of ancient Judaism, the Messiah is the Son of God. All right, so that's chapter 5. I think we've got time. Let's go ahead and do chapter 7 here. So 7 takes on a different look here. Will Messiah come twice? Now, that's quite it doesn't sound like a huge issue, but it really is. That Jesus, when he was alive, we read in the New Testament that he would come again after his death and resurrection. They call that the second coming. And of course, that's been a great hope for 2,000 years for the Christian believers. Now, the catch is virtually all contemporary rabbis reject the idea that the Messiah would come twice. So they're still waiting for the first appearance of the Messiah. They say there's no scriptural or ancient rabbinical foundation for this belief. They said, but both Eastman and Smith said as they were looking at Messianic prophecy, they found that there were, in a sense, two lines of prophecy recognized by the ancient rabbis regarding the life and the ministry and the destiny of the Messiah. Several of the prophecies predicted a suffering Messiah, that he would come, he would die for the sins of a people, but then you'd have also prophecies that would talk about a ruling and reigning Messiah, which of course it would be hard to put those together. So no ancient rabbinical writer denied that the subject in these two different lines of prophecy was a messianic figure, but they couldn't figure out how could one individual in one lifetime both rule and reign on the throne of David forever and yet be despised and rejected and suffer and die. We can see that in Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 52. So they kind of split the Messiah idea in two. So they thought maybe there was one Messiah for each line of prophecy. But as these two authors point out, one individual could accomplish both lines of prophecy. How is that? He'd have to come twice. So the question, of course, is there ancient evidence that the rabbis thought that might be a solution? So the two Messiah theory, that there'd be two different Messiahs, one a ruler and one being abused and killed, that developed in the 1st or 2nd century, around Jesus and after Jesus. Nobody knows who first proposed it, but it became rooted pretty firmly in the Talmud. So they said, let's take a look, and they've gone back and they've done some research in Messianic prophecy, and they said there's no place where a plural personal pronoun is used to talk about the Messiah. They're all singular. So they go back, for example, to Deuteronomy 18. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people like myself. Him you shall heed. I will raise up a prophet from them among their own people like yourself. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. And if anybody fails to heed the words he speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. So that's Deuteronomy 18, verses 15, and then 18 and 19. So what's going on there? That God is going to raise up a prophet among the Jewish people, and he's going to put his words into that mouth of that Messiah. And there's no plural pronoun like they or theirs. It's singular. If you go back even earlier, look at Genesis 3. People see that as the first messianic prophecy. The seed, singular, the seed of the woman will bruise the head. Not a bunch of them, one. If you go to Micah 5, talking another undisputed prophecy of the Messiah, and you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, least among the clans of Judah, from you one shall come forth to rule Israel for me, one whose origin is from old, from ancient times. So God says through Micah that one will come forth, not two, but one. So it says if you look at all of the known Old Testament messianic prophecies, you'll find there's no direct scriptural evidence for a multiple of messiahs. It's always the singular pronoun. No problem there. They said, look again in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We just covered that. It references a single messianic figure. One person said this. It was a Hebrew scholar, two of them actually, Michael Wise and James Tabor. They took a look at 4Q521. They said, astonishingly, this is quite close to the Christian concept of a Messiah. It speaks not only of a single messianic figure, but describes him in extremely exalted terms, quite like the Christian view of Jesus as a cosmic agent. That there was, in fact, an expectation of a single messianic figure at Qumran is really not so surprising. A re-examination of the Qumran literature on this subject leads one to question the two messianic prophecy theory, so that there would be two messiahs. That makes you kind of scratch your head and question that. So they said, the Messiah of our text is closer to the Christian Messiah than in any previously published text. So it said, interesting, that in Qumran, they weren't thinking of two different messiahs, they're thinking of one. So it's changed the idea that they were expecting two. No, they were expecting one. The Qumran community was expecting one Messiah. The authors later go on to say that there was a belief among the Qumran community that the Messiah would suffer defeat, but that he would ultimately triumph in the end of days. So again, the Qumran community believed the Messiah would come once and suffer defeat, but later time he would triumph at the end of days. It sounds like, pretty obviously, it sounds like two appearances of a single Messiah. One is in humility and degradation and death, and the other one is covered in glory. And they believed, the Qumran community believed that the Messiah was going to come when they lived, which is right around the time of Jesus, maybe a little bit before and a little bit after. But the Qumran community thought the Messiah was going to come then. Why? Because of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. And I've covered that in other places, other podcasts, but just real quickly, if you remember that, Daniel talks about so many weeks, and that translates to sevens of years. Each week is 7 years. If you multiply that all out from the time that decree was issued by Artaxerxes, according to Daniel, you come up with 30 A.D., which is, of course, the time of Jesus. So the Qumran community must have been really excited because they could run those numbers as well. And it said, this is a quote from Wise and Tabor again, "We know the Qumran group was intensely interested in the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. They tried to place themselves within this chronological scheme. They must have made something out of this Messiah figure who was cut off." Yeah, so that's interesting. They call him the teacher of righteousness. But at least some in the Qumran community were expecting a single Messiah. They called him the teacher of righteousness. There was a belief there that he would suffer defeat, at least initially, but he would triumph in the end of days. So they believe that the Qumran community thought Messiah would be killed, cut off. That's what Daniel talked about. But they also placed the suffering servant prophecies first, and then they thought the ruling and reigning prophecies were later on, so that Messiah would come during their time, get killed, but come back at a later time in glory. So it's very close to the Christian idea. So there's some scholarship that they point out that demonstrates that the idea of a single Messiah, just the idea of a single Messiah, was the rule, not the exception, during the first century, right around the time of Jesus or before Jesus, slightly before Jesus. So if there's one Messiah, we should find evidence, they said, in the scriptures that he would fulfill both angles of prophecy, the humiliation and death and the victory. And said, you look through that, of course, in Isaiah 52, you see two lines of prophecy united. It says, for example, in the Jewish publication of Isaiah 52:13, "My servant shall prosper, be exalted, and raised to great heights." And yet, if you follow a few verses later into Isaiah 53, "Despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering, familiar with disease, wounded because of our sins, crushed because of our iniquities," and on and on. So you see a despised, rejected servant, but he would also prosper and be exalted. And if you go to Zechariah, another messianic prophecy, again you have those two parts of prophecy. Rejoice. So I'm just going to read parts of Zechariah 9, 2 verses. "Rejoice, Your king is coming to you. He's victorious. He's triumph. He will banish chariots. I'm just reading portions of it. He shall call on nations to surrender. Here he's portrayed as a victorious a victor, a champion, a winner. But he comes on a lowly ass, a donkey foaled by a she-ass. So really, you got two angles there. Look at Daniel 9. We get the coming Messiah being described. He'd come to rebuild the temple. Yeah, there would be an end of sin, but he would be cut off, which is to be killed. They're destroyed. So this is the Christ. So again, you see, he's going to accomplish great things. That's Daniel 9, but he's going to get killed as well. So it said, since there's really no scriptural evidence for two messiahs, and you can unite both prophecies into a single figure, then we're talking probably Jesus. Could the Messiah, in a single appearance, both rule and yet be despised, or does he have to come twice? Well, it looks like there's no end for his victory, and that must be fulfilled later. It's got to be last. And so the Messiah's ruling will come after his rejection. It's logical you could fulfill both of them in the appearance of a single individual. And would the Messiah come twice? Is there some reference to that? Yeah. Book of Hosea, they said, Hosea 5. What's said there? I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face. Let us return to the Lord. He will raise us up. So God is saying, I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Where is God returning from? He says, I will return again. And so again sounds like a second time, doesn't it? Seems to indicate God visited earth at some point in time and then returned to his place. And he's coming back again. So what are they saying here? There's no evidence for two separate messiahs. In fact, new evidence points out the Qumran community believed in one Messiah. They use singular pronouns for the Messiah. There's evidence that both lines of prophecy could be united into the life of Jesus, into one person. And you look at the book of Ruth, they talk about that. A prophecy there, types and shadows in the second chapter of the book. I think I'll skip over that. And so in fact, this is probably time that I'll knock off here. But two comings of the Messiah is exactly what Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be accomplished through his life, that he came once and it was a terrible ending to that life, but through the resurrection, he's alive now and will be coming again. So that's chapters 5 and 7 of this book, Search for Messiah. I hope you get a feel for what it's doing, looking back at ancient writings, looking at the New Testament, looking at the Hebrew books of the Old Testament. And so I think it's really good news, and I think it's exciting material there. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast today. Take care.